Hi, this is Dr. Bowker, coming to you as the Profounder Professor. And today I'd like to diverge a little bit from the plan of action I had in mind when I began these videos and talk about Freud. I'm teaching a course right now on aggression and violence, and I'm so deeply immersed in reading and rereading Freud's Civilization and its Discontents. I thought it would be a good time while it's fresh in my mind to post a couple videos that get to the heart of what is a really difficult book, one that I've read multiple dozens of times and still keep having to reread because it's not really written in a linear fashion. And it's got a lot of little gems hidden throughout it that need to be highlighted. And I'm going to try to pick a couple of those and highlight them and also summarize in two different parts. This will be part one, what Freud is trying to say in the book. And again, it's a complicated argument, and there's a couple of key things he's aiming at, which he's not always clear about. The first thing I'd like to say is he slips an important line in on, I think, page 20 or something, which says, is it possible that something of our mental life remains with us as if we had built anew upon the ruins of an old city, or something to that effect? So think of Rome, a city built upon the ruins of a city, built upon the ruins of a city, and so on, many times. This, to me, recalls the old sort of biological misformulation or formulation, which has subsequently been, I think, biologically speaking, misproven, but interesting philosophically, that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which is a mouthful. And all it means is ontogeny, which is the individual and its development, recapitulates and repeats and re experiences what happens at the group level or the species level. Um, to me, this is important for at least a couple of reasons. One, it sets up his foundation for the development of the psychoanalysis that operates throughout life, where things experienced in childhood can be later interpreted as still meaningful in adulthood. But even more broadly, I think it's as close as Freud comes to defending his idea of instinct. For the most part, for Freud and for a lot of Freudians and even others, instinct is something that is just plain irreducible. It's an essential biological inheritance or endowment, and we can't get really much deeper than that. It's a pulsion, an instinct, a drive, and it's something that we are born with. For Freud, of course, in Civilization and its Discontents, there's two that he's most concerned with. Eros, or libido, is the one, and aggression is the second one. He will call it occasionally death, but he hasn't in this book taken the time to fully develop a theory of the death drive and Thanatos and some of the other complications with that. So we're really dealing with sort of love in a very general sense. Love, eros, is not just erotic satisfaction, but anything that is life affirming, life giving, that brings people together, that brings us close to other people, that gives us warm feelings, that makes us feel that we belong, et cetera, friendship, whatever. And aggression is anything that empties that out, that moves us toward death or toward something uh, that is not a loving embrace, anything that depletes the organism, that destroys life, that negates our life on Earth here together. So that just gets slipped in one line, and yet it's really, in a certain way, the foundation of what he wants to say. He begins the book, however, with an interesting caveat that only pops up a couple of later times and isn't really the point of the text at all, but is also really telling. And that's when he describes his friend. His Freud's friend is a religious person who has come to discover an oceanic feeling with himself. And the oceanic feeling of of Freud's friend is one of complete immersion in something good and safe, and he feels whole and complete. And Freud says two things about this, really, about religion. He says, number one, um, it would be foolish to think that the feelings of helplessness that we have as young people, children, and the need for a father that we have are unrelated to the need for religion. So this is an idea. It comes up again much later in the future of an illusion, much more fully rather in that text. Um, but it's an interesting, miniature hypothesis he sort of throws out there. More importantly, I think he wants to say, listen, the absence of unhappiness or guilt that this individual is experiencing is reminiscent of a time before this person was a person in a sense of a separate individual. So the oceanic feeling refers for Freud to a state of pre ego development or even pre ego instantiation, where the baby is, in so many words, one with the mother or caregiver. And I'll use mother, but Freud means caregiver, and we can substitute caregiver for that. And also with the world. So the baby feels hunger, the baby hallucinates a bottle. The next thing you know, a bottle appears, and in the baby's experience, this is because of the primary narcissistic infantile omnipotence of the baby to create and generate anything that it wants in the world, because essentially it is the world. The world and the ego have not yet been separated or differentiated. That's important because the book takes off from the starting point of when this period of pre-ego development ends. And that's the point at which the ego separates itself out from its environment and from significant others like the mother, the father, the caregiver. And now has to face a whole different reality. In fact, one could say, what face reality point blank. Uh, the infant in a narcissistic, omnipotent, infantile position is living according to the pleasure principle in full, is just following its needs and desires and seeking gratification all the time. But once the ego becomes separated and there are now objects, which are just others, but in the object relations terminology, we call them objects, and Freud also calls them objects. There are objects in the landscape. One has relationships now with mother and father and the world that were once just unities. These relationships complicate things, and they complicate things on an exponential scale. So as the young child develops an independent sense of self, so by Freud's accounting, society moves from a sort of primordial state into a state of civilization. Um, the gory tale about how this is accomplished is spoken of in Totem and Taboo, and a couple other texts by Freud. It's referenced in Civilization and its Discontents, and the idea is that a band of brothers join together to kill and cannibalize the primal father, who is uh, hoarding all of the potential sexual objects, the women of the girls of the group, and is hoarding all the material resources for himself, and is ruling over and enslaving all others by brute force. So at this stage, the brothers rise up and cannibalize the father. Immediately, they feel guilty and overwhelmed with anxiety, and they institute laws that essentially recreate the father in the form of the laws of society and the taboos of society, the two universal taboos really being murder, which they've committed, and incest, which is something that they've now perhaps made a blow in search of. So now our life gets complicated, and Freud says quite plainly, life is hard, and this is why and when life gets hard for us. We need palliatives to make our life tolerable. And Freud's social contract that he sets up is essentially that we regulate or uh, supervise our social relationships by replacing individual brute instinct with civilized law and morality. And the family is, of course, the agent of imposing the society's law and morality on the child. So you have to think about the continuity between the family and the civilization, and the family is really the primary means of delivering the education required to survive in a civilization to the young child. In the reality principle, under the governing reality principle, life is hard, and there's no way to achieve our pleasures the way that we thought we might, or the way that we used to achieve our pleasures simply by wishing for them or by having them delivered to us via hallucination or even via a doting parent. So now we are faced with a number of different options. We can deflect and deny and distract ourselves. There are substitute satisfactions. We can intoxicate ourselves. We can sublimate, which turns out to be a very important idea for Freud, which means to take a basic instinct and upscale it to the point where it becomes something valued by society and accords with what society thinks is right and valuable. And the example would be just someone who has an aggressive impulse and instead of having that come out in a brutish way, composes a piece on the piano that's particularly staccato and particularly aggressive. And yet, nevertheless, it's creating music, and the aggressive impulse has been channeled through a socially acceptable and socially valued means of artistic production. The final solution, or not really the final solution, but the final option he gives, and he reflects just for a moment on this, is well, we can also develop neurosis because neurosis is defined as the inability to satisfy one's instinctual demands under the reality principle, under the principle governed by society and our relationships with others. The father, the imagined father, society as a father, God as the father here representing the law and the order of civilization. Um, According to that social contract theory, now uh, we are stuck in a position in a constant struggle between trying to fulfill our desires and being restrained. And it gets more complicated in part two, but being restrained in various ways from doing so because of the order of society and by the order of the reality principle. So essentially, civilization is, he has a famous line, liberty is not a gift of civilization. In fact, it would have been greatest before civilization had ever been invented. So now we have the young or nascent individual facing a new principle where liberty is exchanged. Liberty to pursue one's aims without heeding others is exchanged for a modicum of security. So you don't have to live under the brute force of a primal father or of some other strong, person who rules without any sense of law or order. Um, Civilization becomes that which is developed upon the renunciation of instinct. And that's an important definition, and really where we need to get in the first part. Civilization, and Freud speculates, gosh, wouldn't it be interesting if an entire community could be neurotic? And I think, of course, a lot of work has been done since Freud, even some of my own, which analyzes this very possibility that entire groups and societies and the world can become, in a sense, psychologically sick from the dilemma that it faces. And the methods it uses, many of which are unhealthy, or neurotic or pathological or otherwise not progressive for the individual or for the group, to cope with its loss of instinctual satisfactions. Um, but civilization is built on the renunciation of instinct. This, what he calls cultural frustration, then breeds even more aggression. So we've started with an initial set of instincts, which are more or less irreducible, one of which is aggression. Aggression then as we move into a state of the reality principle, as we move into a civilized state, is prohibited and needs to be dealt with in some way. Um, Freud says later that the way we deal with our repressed aggression is through a sense of guilt, and that guilt becomes, as we'll see in the next video, the most important issue in the entire question of civilization, because the shared sense of guilt is what unites us, and it becomes, in effect, a technology of society. But we have built upon that renunciation of initial aggression, a secondary form of aggression based on the frustration we feel having renounced our initial aggression and renounced our other instincts in favor of safety and security. I think that does justice to the first part of Freud in a nutshell. There's so much there, it's hard to parse the meaningful from the less meaningful. And there are certainly, it would certainly be possible to do an entire video on just Freud's sort of social contract theory, the way the community sets itself up as right, quote unquote, and the way that that aligns with what he later introduces in the book, which is the idea of the overarching power that takes its force from the id and turns aggression back against the self, which is, of course, the superego. But I'll talk about that a little bit more next time. For now, what we need to know is about the oceanic feeling, the transition from the primary process and pleasure principle orientation toward the world to a more complex, but also more inhibited, reality based, object oriented civilization, society, socially structured version of the world, and the way that that in itself creates not only unhappiness, but can create a secondary form of aggression, which we take out on others, on people who are seen to be blocking our satisfaction, on people who seem to be slightly different, or on people who seem to be violating the law themselves. And these people are highly ambiguous and ambivalent characters. Sometimes we love them for being able to escape the bind that we're in. Sometimes we hate them for cheating the law and the order of justice, which is really the prime demand of civilization and society. So I hope that summarizes briefly the first 50 pages or so of Civilization and its Discontents. It's got a lot more going on in the second half, and sort of launches from this standpoint. But if you don't understand this basic framework, it becomes difficult, I think, to move into the second half and to move into a more intricate understanding of Freud's psychology and his sort of social psychology, if you will, of what happens as we move into a civilized condition.